Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
Seven is a brilliant dissection of the cop genre, a genre that espouses to uphold the virtues of law enforcement and the citizens they aim to protect. The cop genre, with its simplistic good guys versus bad guys preoccupation, weren't satisfying enough for Andrew Kevin Walker, the writer of Seven, who was living a miserable life in New York, working at Tower Records when he decided to write the script. For Walker, the world was most definitely not a fine place, and he wanted to explore the complex nature of its principles and values. To do this, he created two cops who would act as not just characters, but symbolic examples of the existential conundrum Walker was fascinated with. Somerset and Mills represent two sides of this conundrum. Somerset, having spent a great deal of time immersed in the hellish landscape of a depraved city, has a fundamental understanding of the nature of human beings, how low they can sink, how far they can go in creating misery and suffering for themselves and those around them. The world doesn't make any sense to him any longer. He believes it to be beyond redemption and has decided he no longer wants to participate in its madness. There is a deleted scene from the film meant to take place in the prologue, where Somerset goes to look at a country house he was planning to buy. He was looking for a drastic change in scenery and potentially wanted to get as far away from human life as possible. Mills, on the other hand, represents naivete and fresh-faced optimism. While his heart is in the right place, he's simply too young and inexperienced to realize just how overwhelmingly oppressive, demoralizing, and destructive the world can be. He hasn't witnessed the horrors Somerset has, and as a result, carries a very simplistic and overly dismissive view of society. For Mills, the world is made up of a few bad apples who are mentally ill, while most everyone else is perfectly normal. This feeds into his black and white thinking, and it leaves him vulnerable to John Doe's tactics.
If we catch John Doe and he turns out to be the devil, if he's Satan himself, that might live up to our expectations, but he's not the devil. He's just a man.
Somerset is saying here that, no matter how unimaginable the horror of these murders are, the perpetrator, with all his righteous indignation and shadowy maneuvering, is only human. But, in a way, that's the biggest horror of all, that someone who is in fact just a man could commit acts in such a malicious, violent, and depraved manner. On a deeper level, Somerset understands that, to Mills, the acts of John Doe may seem larger than life, but that in order to catch him, they must divorce themselves from the emotion of these horrors and focus on a mere perpetrator. Mills is reluctant, though. To him, Doe is a crazy person, and crazy can't be understood. Doe is an other, an anomaly, while everyone else is normal. What the movie is trying to say, and what Mills doesn't seem to understand, and what Somerset is trying to convince him of, is that the very people he feels the need to fight for are part of the problem. The problem isn't one of bad people versus good people. The problem is human nature itself. Even Somerset admits that he's no better, that apathy is a solution.
Do you like what you do for a living? These things you see?
No. No, I don't. But that's life, isn't it?
Somerset understands that John Doe's very existence is a result of this apathetic world. It created him. So the world itself is part of the problem, and as a result, there will always be a John Doe, as long as the madness of society continues. This is something Mills simply doesn't seem to understand. It's this human nature that John Doe relies on to complete his masterpiece. He knows what Mills will do to him when he realizes what's happened to his wife. For Doe, it's just a matter of being there when he finds out. Mills will take care of the rest. Human nature will take care of the rest. Because deep down inside, everyone was capable of eschewing their basic moral principles to satisfy their own selfish inner desires. This was John Doe's entire point, that society, with its good people versus bad people belief system, was a great big lie. Mills had no problem being judge, jury, and executioner, and betraying his entire belief system as a cop to satisfy his own emotions. For John Doe, this key human frailty was part of what made his murders necessary. Mills's basic understanding of the world comes from the cop shows and movies he probably grew up on. These stories were indicative of society's desire to protect itself from the dark forces that threaten to upend their consumer-focused existence. For society, sin was extreme. It was theft and murder, excessive violence. This allowed people to separate themselves from other undesirables and espouse themselves as so-called good people. Your average person went to work, paid their taxes, supported their families. They were good. But for John Doe, sin was far simpler. It was as easy as ignoring the cries of a woman in a dark alley, or looking at yourself in the mirror too much, or lying for a living. In this way, almost everyone was guilty and deserved to be punished. Doe's point was that sin is sin. There was no difference between a murderer and a model with a prideful, inflated ego. And for people like Somerset, who needed a metronome to drown out the insanity of the city in order to sleep, what was the difference between people who broke the law and people who kept them up at night? They were all bad, because they all participated in deforming cities like the one in Seven, and making it a place decent people like Tracy would want to avoid. And this is exactly why Somerset understood John Doe, because on some level, there was part of him that agreed with this monster, at least in principle. John Doe's mission, regardless of his methods, was to wake people up to what they had done to this world. And this is one of the brilliant conceits of Seven. It challenges the audience to look beyond the black and white duality of everyday life and examine the gray areas, the areas that make people uncomfortable. Doe was asking people to look in the mirror and ask themselves if they could truly be considered good. Doe's, by any means necessary tactics, were grisly and horrifying, but there was a greater message underneath the violence of the murders. For Somerset, John Doe was the inevitable conclusion to a long career of trying to solve the ills of society. Doe represented the awful truth of what he had been denying for years. But in the end, surprisingly, Doe becomes the catalyst of Somerset's rebirth. For Somerset, there is something in seeing Mills completely eviscerated emotionally and psychologically, seeing such a hopeful, optimistic beacon of good intentions shattered beyond all recognition. This creates the spark that reignites the fire inside Somerset to strap on his weapon and badge again. And for the audience, Somerset's change of heart is meant to inspire that, regardless of all the misery and suffering, there is a way out, that there is redemption for even those who have given up all hope, that no matter how bad things get, no matter how unimaginable the horror, the human condition is about never giving up. Because someday, somehow, things will get better. So in the end, while the world may not be a fine place, it is indeed worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.